Dr. Kgosientsho Ramokgopa provided an update on the implementation of the Energy Action Plan. We get you a sense of how we should understand the good news from the Electricity Minister. We're now joined by energy economist Lungile Mashele. Lungile, thank you very much for your time this morning. So South Africans and industry can pat themselves on the back because they've been heeding the call to use energy sparingly. We close the week with an extra 1,000 megawatts in terms of improvement, with the Energy Minister saying that they're sticking to philosophy and planned maintenance.
So good morning, and thank you so much for having me. It certainly is good news, and this is attributed to the actions both at Eskom as well as individuals such as you and myself who have heeded the call to reduce our electricity demand. You will remember that at the beginning of the week, there was a pilot program that was launched, demand-side management, looking at load limiting, especially in the four-ways area. Reduce demand during peak periods. They were rewarded by not having load shedding, but naturally they would not be able to use all of their appliances. If this is successful, it can be rolled out throughout the entire country. Now, this bodes well for what do we do to continue living our lives as best as we can, but also being cognizant that there's a demand, or rather like a supply crisis. And so we're hopeful that this will be a successful pilot. Over and above that, if you look at Eskom's performance over the last month in particular, it has been stellar. We're sitting at about an average of 60% energy availability factor, largely as a result of, if we look at the temperatures that we have currently, they're typically unusual for this time of the year. And this is why we have not reached the peak demand that Eskom had forecast of about 34,000 megawatts. We sort of are just under 31,000 megawatts, which we only reached this previous week. Also, if you look at Eskom's performance on their own fleet as well, it has increased considerably by about 5 percentage points. And this also bodes very, very well for, going into the rest of the winter season and hopefully for the rest of the year as well.
An area the Electricity Minister says that remains vulnerable is that of transmission, which undermines the ability to bring on board new capacity for renewables. He spoke of a need to address the issue of transmission and spoke of an transmission development plan that Eskom is working on, and how they're going to do this is by, one, tapping into rich liquidity of the private sector, two, not relinquishing ownership of the grid, and three, the system operator as Eskom will remain the manager of the utility. How should we understand this plan, more so when he speaks of tapping into the rich liquidity of the private sector?
So the key thing to understand is that the Transmission Development Plan is an annual plan that is developed by Eskom, and it basically looks at various avenues, various ways in which they can expedite grid access, which areas need refurbishment, which areas need a completely new grid, as well as some of the challenges that they face. One of the key issues that are needed to unlock this transmission development plan is actually funding. And this is why the minister was referring to leveraging the private sector for their funding. Also understanding that there's a moratorium on Eskom being able to actually borrow over the next 3 years. So as a result, they will need to come up with innovative ways to finance this transmission, but not under the Eskom banner. This is where the private sector also comes in. But he went on further to reiterate that this does not mean giving the grid or grid access to private sector to actually run. It will still be under Eskom, and more specifically the transmission company of South Africa, and that the system operator will still have oversight over what needs to happen. The key thing is that if we do not look at transmission, we risk having stranded assets as we're having now. We risk an issue. We were not able to invest in new projects, which is where we're currently sitting now. Typical project finance 101 tells us that you cannot build new generation capacity until you have started building your transmission, so that they meet each other at some point. This is the crisis that we're currently facing now, a grid crisis. Over and above that, you have the private sector that has basically eclipsed what should ideally be a public good, and they've taken ownership of it, and they've basically hogged it. Obviously not all of private sector, but certain elements. And so as a result, they have booked this grid and grid capacity, but their projects are not going to come online in the next 18 months or the next 2 years even. And ultimately, there are other projects for the public good which are available and do need to be expedited as well.
You speak of hogging by some sectors in the private sector, or by some elements in the private sector. How should we understand the involvement of the private sector, especially when you speak about affordability for the average South African, where some sectors of society are questioning the justness of this just energy transition?
Absolutely. So if we look at the transmission grid as it is ideally what we call a public good and should be available for South Africans. Now, what has happened over the last year is that in opening up the industry and liberalizing it, you have a situation where the private sector has come on board and has said, give me grid access, which is fine and well, but their projects are for themselves. They certainly, for the most part, are not looking at building projects for South Africans. So these are large energy intensive users, and they're saying, I would like to book this grid capacity for me and my mine, and I'm going to use it in that way. I might wheel or sell this electricity to another large entity down the road, but for the most part, it's more for private use. In terms of South Africans every day, it affects us in terms of this could have been used for public grid access. This could have been used for other projects which are going to serve the public as a whole. Yes, there is a benefit in the private sector taking up this piece of the grid and therefore reducing demand, but ultimately you would want a coordinated effort between public, private sector as well as Eskom, which is what they're trying to achieve now. Although some sectors do feel, and rightfully so, that the requirements that Eskom has put forward in their grid queuing rules are perhaps a little too onerous as well.
He also mentioned other areas that require attention, and that includes partial load losses, where units are operating but not at optimal capacity. Another area is outage slips, but we are seeing a downward trend, as well as unplanned capacity loss factor. We're also seeing a downward trend there. What is it overall that the electricity minister is managing to do that has not been done? I mean, when he explains it to you, he makes it sound like it's not rocket science. Visit the station, speak to management. At one point, he's like, it's a leadership issue as well, praising quite a lot, a particular Mr. Beki Ngumalo, and he mentions that this is an engineering problem. So what is the magic stick or the magic wand that is being used here that we have not been using all along?
So, it's when I look at Eskom's unplanned capability loss factor, this was as of May, it was sitting at about 37.5%. If I look at it where it is over the last month of June, it was about 32%. This is a 5 percentage point difference, ultimately. Why has there been this improvement in their unplanned maintenance? Well, firstly, it speaks to the ambient temperatures that we are experiencing, that they are lower like in winter. Therefore, your plant performance will generally be better. You'll have less boiler tube leaks, etc. But not to take away from Eskom and their performance. I mean, we have the Thabo, we have Matla, which are performing at over 98% energy availability factor. So there has been significant work that has gone into those plants as well. But you also have a very fundamental back to engineering that has happened at Eskom, which has been lacking over the last couple of years. There has also been an increased focus on project management. Now, this obviously does need some refinement. This is why you are sitting with the outage slips that they're referring to, as well as the partial load losses. And perhaps that's the final loop that they need to be focusing on and looking at. And this is not a new issue. This was even raised by the previous generation group executive, speaking about how those project management principles that have fallen by the wayside are responsible for some of the issues that they are facing. It's not intentional, it is not malicious, it is just refining principles and going back to how you should do project management. But I'm hopeful, and it does look like there is a turn in the tide at Eskom, and this is why the minister praised the generation group executive as well as the board chairman in terms of their leadership and direction, because that's exactly what is needed to bolster people's their faith and their hope and their ability to continue working at the utility and delivering performance. Ultimately, it is a people issue, but it's also very much an engineering issue.
Okay, when we take a look at the favorable weather conditions, what happens for the rest of July, what happens in August, should the weather conditions change?
So we experienced it this week already. I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday where there had to be a step change in load shedding, where load shedding was then implemented much earlier than the 4 p.m. that we're now sort of used to. And it was also an increased stage. I think we moved to stage 4. So they will play it by ear. And so as a result, it's up to us and for them also to remain flexible to anything that can happen. But at this point, we are, I suppose, grateful that the weather gods have played their part as well, and that hopefully this weather pattern and weather conditions, and perhaps what we're seeing an early stage of El Nino, will continue throughout the winter period. Then in summer, you then sit with a completely different issue, which is where Eskom starts now ramping up for their summer maintenance. And then load shedding will definitely increase at that point unless new capacity comes on board. And we're told this will only come on board in December with the 3 units at Lungile and the 1 unit at Newzroom.
The electricity minister said they are being meticulous, deliberate, applying a degree of granularity in understanding units and to address the situation. He would not be pressed to say this is when load shedding is going to end. He will not be pressed to give a deadline or a timeline. And so how should we understand that as opposed to other leaders who are quite confident that by the elections next year there'll be no load shedding? Who should we listen to? Just the electricity minister, since this is his competency, like he said, he eats, breathes, sleeps, ending load shedding.
So I'm actually glad that he didn't take that populist stance. It has gotten a lot of people in trouble over recent months. You cannot sit and say, I have a definite date, unless you thumb suck it, really. The reality of the matter is that it is a combination of factors. You've got weather, you've got demand, you've got supply, you've got your unit availability, your unit performance, you've got your supply in terms of diesel, in terms of your coal, that's the coal quality that comes in. You've got your intermittent resources, wind and solar. A combination of all of that and how it performs will determine on an hour by hour, in fact on a second by second basis, because that's how the system operator views the system, on a second by second basis, what is going to happen. Therefore, it would be very strange for someone who is sitting in some office in Pretoria to sort of want to predict what is happening at Simmerpan Eskom on a second by second basis. He does, however, emphasize that there is new generation capacity coming on board, and that should ease the situation. However, I would just like to highlight that what we're seeing is what the system operator has been emphasizing for the last 2 years, to say improve your plant performance and you'll reduce load shedding. And if we had listened, or rather if Eskom executives had listened at the time, perhaps our load shedding would not have been as severe.
Lungile Mashele is an energy economist. Thank you very much for your time this morning.